And I'm assuming you're doing all the hosting, opens and closes and all that?
Yep, I'm going to kick it off and then I'll hand it over to Kelly and then he'll go from there.
And you saw my note that we're
Um,
not actually handing out the slides, but they're welcome to download the report that has the data in it.
I did see that. So when we do our content, I'll make sure that we don't use our actual slides for it, or I'll ask you first if it's okay. So,
Sorry, say?
and I'll put the link to the report in as you're talking about it so they can just grab it from chat as well.
Perfect.
Okay. All right. I think I got one more thing to open. I've got it set. Okay, I'm going to go live now. You guys ready?
Yep.
What?
Got your hair all fixed, Kelly? Ready to go?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. Okay, well, welcome and thanks for joining us for our Global Data Vault March webinar. I am Trista Perot, Director of Global Data Vault, and I am kicking off this really interesting session today. If I could just get my slides to advance. Uh-oh, hold on one second. Let's see what happened. Okay, here we go. Now we're back on track. There's me. All right. So today we're diving deep into the minds of thousands of IT leaders and learning what is driving change in their data protection strategies, where they see the future of cloud-powered data protection, and their overall thoughts on cyber preparedness. I don't want to stand in the way of this really interesting session, but a little housekeeping. If you need to leave early or you want to rewatch this session, you'll be able to find it immediately on our YouTube channel or a condensed transcription of the session on our website in a couple of days. And one last thing, don't, and I say don't, withhold your questions until the end because our guest today would love your thoughts in the moment. So be sure and flip those questions into chat and we'll serve them up to him as we go along. So with that, let me introduce okay, guys, just know that my trigger is a little slow today as we go through the slides. So there we go. With that, let me introduce our team and expert guests today. And we have invisible, but moderating in chat. We have Brian Brignac and Leslie Ferris from our sales department. And as for our speakers today, we have a familiar face with Kelly Caldwell, who's our service delivery manager and host of our live discussions. But joining him is a very special guest, Jason Buffington, who is Vice President of Solution Strategy for Veeam and the co-author of the very impressive industry report that's our topic matter for today. Jason has 3 decades of experience in the data protection, availability, BCDR, and systems management space, and we are so grateful to have his expertise with us. So enough from me. Kelly and Jason, take it away.
Cool. Thanks, Trista. Jason, welcome. First of all, we appreciate the time here today. So we're here to discuss a report that you guys publish annually now, right?
Yep.
Why don't you get into telling us a little bit about it?
Yeah. So as Trista mentioned, I've been in the data protection space for about 32 years. Only thing I've ever done since getting out of school. And 7 of those years I spent as an industry analyst. So Veeam was my client, as was Commvault and Rubrik and Cohesity and Dell and Veritas and IBM. And so I spent a lot of time doing industry research, and I've been with Veeam for the last 4 years. One of the projects that that I've been participating in for the last several years is our annual Data Protection Trends Report. It's important to note, Veeam contracts with an outside independent research firm. They ask all the questions to their panel. These are not Veeam customers or Veeam marketing that gets involved in this. This year's report, the Data Protection Trends Report for 2022, is actually the largest independent research project in data protection in our industry. Kelly, there's 3,400, technically 3,393 responses in this survey. It covers 28 different countries. The vast majority of responses are from organizations with more than 1,000 employees, although there's a good percentage of even some mid-market, some upper and lower commercial, et cetera. So really excited to share some of the results for this and hopefully hear how Global Data Vault is responding to what 3,400 of my closest friends say they need in data protection.
Yeah, I wonder what happened to those other 7 people that day.
If you want to know, project was only supposed to be 3,000, and we were 393 responses in, and we found out there was a typo in one of the questions, and it
Yeah.
was an important question, and so they oversampled, and that's how you get a lovely round number like 3,393. What you see here is the actual URL. So while we can't share the slides from today's presentation, all the data that I'm going to talk about is actually in the report. And so you can go to VEE.am/DPR, it's Data Protection Report for 22.
Cool.
So let's get nerdy with some data, Kelly.
All right. Wow, this is a lot of data. What are we looking at here?
All right. So I mentioned that we've done this report a couple years in a row. So take a look just on the left-hand side, and I'll walk you through what it really looks like. So in 2020, for that report, we asked organizations what percentage of their servers were physical in the data center, virtual in the data center, or cloud hosted, either hyperscale or MSP based. And that's the lime green that you see on the left of each of the 3 kits. And that's 2020. And we also asked, what do you think it's going to be 2 years from now? Right? Next year, the next report comes out. So 2021, that's the light bluish green, second from the left of each kit. And then what they thought was going to be 2 years later, that gives us 2023. This year, that middle of the bands, that's the darkest of them, is 2022. And then over on the right-hand side, what they think is going to be in 24. So you interleave 3 different annual reports, 8,000 IT leaders across those 3 reports across the way. And you see a couple really interesting trends that I think makes a good basis for us to start the conversation with. And that is, first of all, notice how the lime green on the left is a little taller, right? In the physical, the lime green is actually 2020 data is pre-COVID. Whereas the other 4 bands in each kit is post-COVID. And we all know that one of the effects of the global pandemic and the global quarantine was that a lot of organizations accelerated their use of cloud services in response to a remote workforce. And so you see that show in the lines. But then beyond that, so you see that, that physical goes down, that virtual goes down, the net result, cloud goes up, right? But beyond that, what you see is that never does the data center go to zero. There are a lot of reasons why you should still be running your own metal on your own floor in your own facility. But we do see there's a slight declination that happens on the physical servers on the left. And I'm going to attribute a lot of that just down to if you're in your second, third, or fourth year of extended maintenance on that really fancy, expensive monolithic storage array, at some point you're going to end of life that bad boy. Right. And so there is a gradual decline that comes out of that. You can see that virtual, the middle set of infrastructure, stays flat, right? It's 24 plus or minus 1 for 4 years running. So, and then everything on that right-hand side is basically what you see is as organizations are deploying new workloads, most organizations are taking an authentic cloud-first approach, which basically says if you can stand it up in a cloud, why wouldn't you? And then what that does is, though, is we recognize that most organizations are not decommissioning old platforms and workloads at near the same rate they're spinning up new ones. So what you see is that physical and virtual is actually their percentage is eroding or diluting as more and more workloads embrace cloud hosted. And certainly the net result for folks on today's call is this is why it's so important that your data protection architecture equally addresses legacy physical platforms, modern virtual platforms, and multiple cloud-hosted IaaS and SaaS architectures, because this is not a fad and this is not coming, it is here. And hopefully folks can take that away. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned, the pandemic had a lot to do with this and the way that we use data, the way that we embrace virtualization. We're protecting different types of data, we're accessing it from different areas, different locations. And so in my view of this, people are saying, okay, we have our infrastructure, we still need that, But
Yeah.
now that we have to do all of these other new things, let's just go ahead and put that in the cloud, and we still have to protect it, right?
Yeah. To paraphrase a politician, if you like your data center, you can keep it. But for everything else, there's cloud. So so that kind of sets the landscape for what production looks like, and that's going to kind of drive some of the conversation on what's facing in data protection, right? So when we look at this, two things to point out. So this is one of those questions that I know my friend Brian from your business development folks, he's on as well, and Kelly, you lean into this. One of the questions you always want to ask every customer and every partner out there is, what would drive you to change? I was buying a car for my daughter a couple weeks ago, and the first question is, what are you looking for? Right? What does it need to do? Right? This is the what does it need to do slide. Right. And so when we look at this, what you see on the right hand side is when you can choose all the things that could apply. Right. That's choose all. And then what's most important? And that's the short lines that you see towards the left. And there are kind of two meta trends that come out of this, maybe three. The top one is, let's just look at the top two lines. The two most common, long lines on the right, and most important, short lines, both say, I need backup to work better. Right. And so I want to improve my RPO, I want to improve my RTO, I want to improve my SLAs. There's a dirty little secret in the IT industry. You cannot restore what you did not back up. Right. And so we need to have more reliable and backup. And this is not necessarily to say that all other backups or legacy backup solutions are junk. That's not true. Right. But what it does mean is that as we saw, as many organizations are modernizing production, they haven't always kept up and modernized protection at the same rate. And so, Kelly, you remember this from 15 years ago when Veeam was first starting and virtualization was first starting. The legacy backup solutions would say, just put an agent inside of every VM. It'll work just fine, right? It does not work just fine, right?
Yeah.
There's a better way to do that. And so I think what you're seeing is as organizations are embracing multi and hybrid cloud, their success rates and their SLAs are suffering if they're not using a modern approach for backup. So that's what the top two things kind of lay out. Let me give you another trend and then let's talk about it for a second. And that second trend certainly is around economics. And you see that in that third spot changing from CapEx to OpEx, right? So that's where we look at economics as a consumption matter. In the fourth slot, you see economics improving from ROI and TCO. So recognizing more value for what you're paying for. And then if you go down two or three more slots, you'll see just reducing cost, right? So cost and value and consumption. So certainly those top two trends, in fact, if you add them up, 11 and 9, we got 20%. So 1 in 5 say it's about qualitative improvement. And then the economics ones, we got 9 and 9 is 18, 7 makes 25. So 25% of the time, 1 in 4 organizations looking for better economics. And probably the reason that we're talking today is if you look at the number 5 slot, the number 5 most common driver and most important is around moving from an on-prem backup solution to cloud-based. And I'm going to argue that maybe one of the ways that people are trying to get better improvement and more reliability out of their backup while paying less is because they think maybe the cloud will do that for them. I don't know, Kelly, if you have any thoughts on that.
The answer that we always hate, but it really is true, is that it depends, right? It's going to depend on the service type that you have. It's going to depend upon your RPOs and RTOs. You can sign up for whatever you want. The whole on demand or as a service thing will basically let you pay for whatever it is you need. I think this slide is interesting. If you actually flip it, you start from the bottom to move away from legacy hardware solutions. You mentioned 15, 20 years ago when virtualization was coming up. One of the key factors for driving virtualization at that point, it wasn't cloud. It was just, are you going to virtualize this or not? And way back in the day, Veeam had the concept of are you a server hugger or are you a virtualization lover? I still have the T-shirt that says that. But when you start thinking about it, virtualization is really what enabled true data protection because everything is encapsulated, everything's a file. Before that, you had dependencies on hardware or certain things, and you wanted to move away from those legacy things without limiting yourself. So, moving up that, you really start getting away from the mindset of what hardware, what do I have to buy, but how do I enable it? like all of this stuff in the bottom half is almost a given, in my opinion,
Yep.
these days, to where, okay, we're past all of this. We still recognize the benefit of it, but it's more about what are the benefits of it? What are my drivers for success when I can eliminate all of those low, all the low hanging fruit, et cetera. So we definitely see this, and there definitely is value to it. It's not, data protection specifically in the cloud and hybrid models isn't a I just put in my credentials and I'm expecting this if I go here, and these guys have a big shiny website that says they can do that. But it really becomes a test of whether or not they actually can. So you have to say, I need these RPOs, RTOs. How do you deliver that? What does my CapEx, OpEx look like for this type of a solution? So it's pretty interesting from that standpoint for sure.
Definitely outcome centric. Definitely outcome centric. And yes, to your point, like if you look on the bottom, a lot of the implementation choices, the nerd details. So, for example, one thing that we often hear about is, "Oh, I really want an appliance." Right? It's not that they want an appliance. What they want is they want a right size stack that they don't have to manage.
Yep.
Right. But what you see here is about 6% of organizations, I want to deploy appliance. And then another 6% near the bottom of the list as well is, oh, it has to be software defined. I want to use my own metal. Turns out it's literally 6 of one, half dozen the other. Neither one really matters. I will confess.
Meanwhile, they're all trying to reduce software or hardware costs, right? Like
it's powered choice. Right.
Yeah.
Now I know that in your patch, you talk about local data vaults, and I'm a huge fan. Because of what it gives you from an SLA perspective. But yeah, form factor is not really the deciding factor. A lot of the stuff on the bottom is table stakes. Let's do one more data point though, because I do a lot of work with scouts when I'm not saving the world's backup problems. And whenever you're planning a hike, there's two things you want to know: where you're coming from and where you're going to, right? Because if you know those two things, you can have a good conversation about how you're going to get there. And I imagine your consultants have that same kind of conversation about backup. But this is the where you're coming from. Right? What are you trying to solve for? Let's talk about the where you're going to. So if we go one more slide in, let's look at those modern, what does modern data protection look like? Now, this slide got boogered a little bit. There's some stuff that wasn't meant to be highlighted right away, but we'll try to figure it out. So the question originally was, what would you consider the defining aspects? And there's some things that you can't see that talk about it needs to be part of a backup. Backup should be part of a cyber strategy. There, one of the other ones that you can't see well is that that backup should be part of a holistic strategy that includes IT management, so that you should be doing more with your data. One of the other ones that's highlighted you can't see is that is orchestration. You ought to be trying to get rid of a lot of the manual processes along the way. What you do see is all the cloudy ones. Right. So when organizations are asked, what does cloudy look like? Cloudy looks, or what does data protection look like when it's modern? It looks cloudy. And so there's a recognition of leveraging DR from a cloud. So you have that elastic infrastructure. There's a recognition that you want consistency between how you protect on-prem and how you protect IaaS and SaaS. There's one of the other ones, which I think is really interesting, is recognizing that workloads not only move from the data center to a cloud. Often it's important to move them between clouds as well. So you might do your development originally in Amazon, but then want to run production in Azure, right? You may want to do your development in a cloud, but then you want to run your on-prem for production, right? So being able to actually move stuff back and forth. And while Azure and Amazon will help you get it into their cloud, they won't let you put it back, and they won't let you move it between. And so that's really where a self-describing and cloud agnostic approach for data movement starts to become really important.
Yeah, I agree, and we see it every day. For one reason or the other, customers choose hyperscale cloud, big cloud, some cloud. A lot of organizations, particularly in the public sector, get certain credits with Microsoft, so perhaps they lean toward an Azure deployment. Maybe certain organizations like the scalability and the quick deployment for DevOps in AWS. But they typically have something that pulls it all together, and that's production data. That's where does my data live? How do I protect it? Just like you mentioned. And so what we often hear customers ask for is, here's what I'm doing. How do I protect it? And at the same time, how do we fit the 3-2-1 rule into this? Because like any other solution, none of these things will protect your data natively. You're not going to put your data in the cloud and it's just magically protected. We see outages all the time that affect entire portions of the United States from one big cloud provider or another. Even something simple as a DNS outage affects many, many services. So customers are trying to find ways to leverage and utilize workload flexibility, portability, right? Portability of applications and data, while at the same time still trying to protect it. And that's a challenge that we work to solve, and give a central, easy to manage, easy to use, yet reliable focus on data protection. And
Sure.
we don't care where it is, where you put it, how you do it. We're going to protect it, and we're going to make it available for you.
Well, Kelly, that sounds like a good segue to kind of take a look at where. So everything we've talked about so far leans in from what's modernizing in production, which includes
Yeah.
certainly hybrid and multi as cloud architectures, and then leaning into okay, so what does that mean for protection using the cloud as well?
Yeah, the primary concern is what it's always been, especially now with ransomware, and we're all familiar with how ransomware works. It's going to go after your on premises, your primary data wherever it exists, whether it's in your facility in a data center. It's going to go off after that, and so part of the 3-2-1 rule is 3 copies of your data, 2 different types of media, 1 offsite copy. That's going to protect you from any type of site outage. The 3 copies, the 2 different media will protect you more locally from any type of issues that you might have on premises with certain systems or that copy. But your 1 offsite is going to protect you from fire, from disaster, from maybe ransomware, which we have some pretty cool solutions about that. But when you think about public cloud, people often think of that's, to your word, cloudy. It's protected. I don't have to worry about that. It's in the cloud. Nothing can happen to it. And that is egregiously false. We see it all the time. So no matter if you choose one or the other, public cloud or both or all or a hybrid of on-premises versus clouds, you want something to protect the data offsite. We happen to also be cloud powered, but we also happen to be cloud agnostic, and we have multiple data centers of our own to provide protection that way. So we're not putting all the eggs in one basket. You've got multiple copies of your data, whether they're on premises, in the cloud, in our cloud, et cetera. And as people continue to push more, your first slide there with that right side going up from a hybrid or a cloud utilization, as people continue to push in that, we're going to see further adoption of disaster recovery in a cloud powered scenario.
Yeah, we got some good data on that. Let's go ahead and take a look. So and sorry, it's a little boogered again. So one of the things that we look at when we look at the trend lines across 3 different projects. Let's see what we got. Something about feasibility of migrating. Oh, all right. So there was a question in the chat. Let's cover those while we go around feasibility of migrating out of public cloud. So the idea there is that certainly for as long as people have been migrating from one platform to another, it's always been a one-way thing, right? So when I first started in this industry, I was working on NetWare servers and I was moving them to Windows NT many years ago.
Been there and done that, yeah.
Yeah, gave up many 3-day weekends on that kind of project. Then there was the virtualization wave, right? And so, VMware would give you utility. It would say, hey, I'm going to mirror your physical box and I'll turn it into a VM, P to V.
Yep.
Right. By the way, there was never a utility that went V to P. So if you had to pull it back down again, that was kind of on you. And certainly the same thing was true for Hyper-V. I'm not trying to pick on VMware. Cloud works the same way, right? So Amazon will give you utility that'll get it up into EC2. Microsoft will give you utility that'll get it up into Azure. GCP, I assume, has the same kind of thing. But it's not in their interest, and therefore they don't actually have a utility that'll say, hey, no problem, I'll put it back on-prem for you. Doesn't happen, right? one of the fun parts about Veeam is that we actually do back up the data in such a way that if you want to back it up as a Hyper-V VM and you restore it to a VMware VM, we can do that. If you were back up a physical Windows box and you want to restore it into a VMware instance, you can, or you can restore it into EC2, or you can restore it to Azure or GCP. And oh, by the way, when you back up a VM that's in one of those clouds and you want to bring it back on-prem, would you like that physical? Would you like that into a VMware VM? Would you like that into Hyper-V VM? So the fact that we back up not only the image from the outside, but also self-describing of the characteristics and the set of OSs on the inside. And oh, by the way, in many cases, we'll also even just replumb your network for you, right? All the way down to the Windows registry level. So that being able to have move workloads from any multi-hybrid on or off-prem platform to any other based on the needs of the business, not just based on the IT guys said it's Wednesdays, so we'll put it in Hyper-V. Right? That's not how that works. But if the business says we want to move it from one platform to another because of how Veeam backs that data up, we can restore it to any other hosted, physical, or virtual or cloud platform that you have. And that's different. So,
Yeah.
all right. So getting back to where we are, so let's talk about the fact that when we store that data, we back it up on any format. We can recover it to any other format along that way. We typically will use either regular disk, like what you would build in your own backup server, a backup appliance, a GDV, LDV, any of those kinds of scenarios, and or dedupe disk or tape, or pick your favorite cloud. I have my favorite cloud. Its data center is in Dallas. And when we asked organizations what percentage of your data is cloud or only delivered through on-prem, you see that again, we're using those 8,000 data points off 3 different years with the survey instrument. So in 2020, is about 3 out of 5 organizations leverage cloud as part of their data protection strategy. 2 out of 5 didn't yet. Next year, make some progress, right? It's about 66 using cloud, 34 aren't. 2022, this year, didn't make a whole lot more progress, but it's 67 to 33. But that expectation is that we're going to get more down to about 4 to 1, right? So 4 out of 5 IT professionals will be using the cloud as part of their data protection. 1 out of 5 will be wondering why they're out of a job. Excuse me.
Bless you.
Cannot cover your mouth and hit the mute button at the same time, turns out. All right. So I think that's interesting from there. But one of the things that is when we were looking at this data, this is the way that Veeam normally describes it. What we're looking at is the cloud part of the equation at all. If we go to the second version of this same slide, we can actually get some better insights, which I think might be more interesting for the GDV population. In this case, we still have on the bottom those folks that are only using on-prem technology. So that's disk, dedupe disk, purpose-built disk, and or tape, right? And you can see that erode from 40 to 34 to 33, 19 down to 21. You can see that declination go down. That middle band is now just those that are using self-managed backup of cloud services. That's using S3 and Amazon. It's using Azure Blob Storage, cold or hot, those kinds of things. I'm still the smartest person in the room. I'm still running my own backup solution. I just happen to be having a cloud tier, which is what Veeam calls it. And you can see that that's roughly sitting around the 30% mark pretty consistently, right? So 30, 33, 33, 35, 31. So it's 33 plus or minus 2. But look where the growth is, right? When people first started using the cloud for data protection back in, and we're using 2020 as the proxy, is about even money, 30% self-managed, 29% using backup as a service. By 2024, it's more like a little over, not quite 2 to 1, 48% of respondents using backup as a service versus 31% that are using self-managed. So the growth is around recognizing that even though organizations might first say, it's a cloud, all clouds are the same, throw your data up in a cloud, right? And what they figure out is if they're still the smartest person in the room and they're still the one managing the backups, troubleshooting the logs, capacity planning, all the architecture that goes into that, at some point they figure out the cloud is not a silver bullet. And the only thing you've done is added survivable data. Yeah. Right. And so that's where we see that. I wouldn't call it repatriation, but I do think of it as a good, better, best. Good, you're backing up your data. Better, you get your data got out of the building. Best, someone smarter than you is driving it, right? And so I think that's where you see that growth coming year over.
Yeah, and maybe it would be interesting to see how this varies with different sizes. The organizations of different size, if they have a wide and broad IT staff with a lot of expertise, and you have 50 people who can handle different things versus I'm an IT staff of 3, or me, or we're too busy focusing on business driving initiatives. We can't, we don't want to focus on that. Let's bring something else into play. And it goes back to the other point of businesses adopting more of an OpEx model versus a CapEx, because year over year, what's the rate this year that we see data increase? I mean, is it 30% year over year, 40%?
On-prem, it's closer to 20 to 25%. Cloud hosted, it's higher than that. So,
Yeah, so
by
they're
the way,
looking,
just on your last question, when you're asking about, hey, would it be interesting to see based on size? We actually did ask that question. It's not in today's deck, but it actually is in a different report that we did on BaaS and DRaaS services. And we looked at why do different size organizations adopt cloud services and what kind of services are they offering. And actually, if you can imagine, it's a bell curve. And what you find where we looked at small and mid-sized organizations, commercial organizations, say 250 to 1,000 employees, and then enterprises being 1,000 or more. And the bell curve basically shows that from an adoption rate perspective, there was actually higher interest in both the SMB and the enterprise on adopting managed backup services compared to commercial. And when we went back and asked organizations why that was, while the shape of the data was symmetrical, the rationale was different. In an SMB, it's exactly as what you were postulating, which was they didn't have much of an IT staff. They knew they needed smarter humans. And so SMBs tend to embrace backup as a service predominantly because they just need someone to help them with success rates, right? We talked about improved reliability. And so for many of them, this was their way to accomplish that by supplementing their expertise through backup as a service instead. On the enterprise side, they have the acumen on staff, although candidly speaking, is that really where you want those high expert, high value IT professionals that are long in their career? Wouldn't you rather them be working on things that are perhaps more strategic to the business than managing last night's backups? And so in that case, what they were trying to do was offload those things that, because they deal with a different kind of scale, they struggle with the mundaneness managed over scale. So if they can offload that, then their individual contributors can actually focus on more things that are more business and value creation and not on babysitting the backups. So it is interesting that that curve is symmetrical, although the rationale between why enterprises are embracing BaaS is different than why SMBs are.
yeah, it's pretty interesting stuff.
So, speaking of expertise, let's take one more look at one other angle when it comes to cloud and data protection. We're going to look at disaster recovery in this case. So, as I said, I've been doing backup for 3 decades. For a good chunk of that, at a certain point, the backup guy starts getting invited to the BCDR meetings. Those meetings are bigger than just backup, right? Disaster recovery is more than just recover the workload someplace else. Surely, if it powers up, it'll work, right? There's a lot more to it than that. I had a great conversation with Stephen from DataPrize on that earlier this week. But um, the net of this conversation is when you look at what disaster recovery really looks like. On the bottom of the slide, you can see that those folks that are still using 2 or more self-managed data centers stays roughly around that 30% of organizations, right? So these are your traditional large enterprises. They already have multiple sets of infrastructure. The East Coast protects the West Coast and vice versa. You have IT staff at both locations. Usually this isn't a massive vCenter type architecture or a Microsoft System Center environment. It's well managed on both sides. And there is a huge amount of power and agility that happens when that's well architected across the way, right? So again, if you have your data centers and you like them, you should keep using them for that. I do think that as that secondary infrastructure goes more end of life, folks are going to have a harder conversation on do we re-up that or not, but that's for a different day.
Yeah.
Look at where the growth is though, right? So the bottom stays relatively flat. Data centers doing protecting each other. The top is where we're using elastic infrastructure, right? So disaster recovery, leveraging cloud-based services. And you see that growth go from 23 to 30 to 36 to 51 to 53. And I'm going to argue there's really two primary drivers for that. Three, if you want to talk about the maturation of the tools, and certainly Veeam can take some credit for that. But take Veeam out of the picture, and you still get two primary drivers as an industry. Certainly, one of them is that elastic infrastructure, right? So if you didn't have two data centers, you couldn't do the bottom, right? And so that top line is where, hey, I'm going to use the cloud, so I have a secondary infrastructure when I need it, and I'm not paying for it when I don't, other than storage. And you see some growth that comes out of that. And technically, you could get that from both a hyperscale Azure Amazon model or from a authentic disaster recovery as a service DRaaS provider. What you don't get until you embrace DRaaS is the expertise. Right. We talked earlier about the kinds of experts that an enterprise organization will have often does not have a BCDR planner on staff. Right. Certainly commercial size organizations don't. SMBs surely don't. Right. So being able to not only leverage infrastructure on demand, but to leverage expertise on demand. The other thing that you'll see is even in a large enterprise, the BCDR planner there only really has one framework of infrastructure to base their architecture and guidance on, whereas a DRaaS provider is delivering BCDR outcomes to organizations of all sizes, and so they get a lot more best practices, a lot more consistency and learning along that way. So I'm going to tell you the reason that disaster recovery is actually becoming more attainable for a broadly increasing percentage of organizations of all sizes is not only that elasticity on demand, but the expertise that authentic DRaaS providers can provide.
Yeah, I agree. It's we're in an age where flipping the switch is a very popular thing. Just turn it on, access it, you need it. There's probably an app for it. You can do it with your phone, type of mentality. So it seems natural to me that although not all people are doing it, disaster recovery as a service is another one of those. It can be easy. You can have people who that's what they do for, a business model, provide that for you. And much, to your point with the BCDR planner and creating that, there's certain niches within an organization where they specialize in one type of IT or another, in my experience. And maybe you have people involved that are familiar with the telephony and the call handling or delivering another type of service, and they fall short on some areas. So I think, from my experience, seeing this being driven by the customer from an ease of use standpoint to organizations that deliver that as a business model is nothing but positive for those organizations.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, when we talk about disaster recovery, one of the problems that has historically always been an issue in our business is for most disasters, folks are willing to make a bet. It won't happen to me, right? Disasters are a win, or they're an if, not a win, right? So Kelly, you and I were talking earlier today. I live in North Dallas, and I was actually in a tornado warning last night. Got some hail. I still have a roof on my house, right? But and if you're in a hurricane pattern, if you're in a fire zone, I mean, there's always those natural disasters, and you're hoping it's an if, not a win. We talk about cyber. Cyber is a disaster. Ransomware is a disaster. Write that down on a post-it note just to make sure you don't forget it. Ransomware is a disaster, but ransomware is a disaster that is a win, not an if. Now, this is an area that you've spent some time on before, and in fact, I think your parent company actually spends even more focus on cyber even than the GDV folks. But talk about your perspective on that, and then I'll share some data on what the industry is showing us.
Yeah, so I held up my badge a minute ago there. You're talking about making a bet, and it kind of goes to, are you willing to bet your badge? Are you willing to bet your job? On whether or not you can successfully recover. And I used to use that example as just from a simple backup, but these days it's, can you recover your entire business? I too live in the same area. I too was under tornado warning last night, but the most recent attacks and the majority of the attacks and issues that we've seen with customers aren't natural disasters. Now, granted, we have our fair share of those, and they're typically large spread. But they're generally short, right? We generally see if something happens, it doesn't take weeks or months to recover from it generally. Now, on the cybersecurity standpoint, we see attacks happening all the time. There's some statistic of the how many thousands of attacks per second that happen across the world. Don't quote me on the numbers or whatever, right? But obviously, we're not having thousands of hurricanes a second going on. Every one of those has a potential to be a disaster for someone, and it's a real number. This is not a fear tactic. It happens, and we get customers panicked calling us for these things all the time. So definitely having some type of cybersecurity awareness planning to go along with your disaster recovery is a must, right? And we do see it daily. It's very prevalent, and it's going to continue, unfortunately.
Yeah, let's talk about that prevalence. And I'm looking at my version of the slides, and actually I want to go ahead one more. Let's talk about ransomware frequency for just a minute. And I'll come back to this one in a second. When we talk about those wins versus those ifs, again, it comes out of that same research out of the DPR report. You should definitely download it because there's a lot of ransomware specific information in it. But this is perhaps to me one of the two scariest slides in the deck. So organizations were asked, how many ransomware attacks has your organization suffered? So successful attacks in the last 12 months. Best case, Kelly, best case, 1 in 4, 24% said no attacks. But I'm going to tell you a best case because for a lot of organizations, they don't know they've been infected yet.
Yeah.
Right. Average gestation on a cyber attack is usually over 200 days. Right. So best case, 24%, 1 in 4 organizations has not been attacked. But the thing that actually bothers me just as much is if you add the nones and the ones together, that's 40%, 60% of the respondents in this survey, again, not being customers, global unbiased sample, 60% had more than one successful attack. Right. Cyber villains is a full-time business. Right. And if they were able to successfully get money from you before, they're going to spend your money. And 6 months from now, if they need more money, they're going to treat you like an ATM. They're going to come back and say, hey, did you fix all those holes? Oh, cool. One's not fixed. Okay. Let me enter my PIN and get more money out again. Right. So certainly frequency becomes the term on this one is just butt ugly scary. It's
Yeah,
just
we heard some interesting stuff. One of our customers got some insight, and I don't remember exactly how they got the insight, but the attacker didn't even know that they had attacked, like that the attack was successful. We had a victim that was hit that basically the attacker was unaware that their attack worked. So it wasn't, stuff was going on, and then it was a while later that they got a message that said, "Oh, I guess my attack was successful. Now give me money," kind of thing. So these things are automated. There's software. It's AI driven. So there doesn't have to be somebody pounding away at a keyboard for these things to happen. And like you said, they could be propagating, or there's so many of them going out, the attackers don't even know who they have. Maybe they're backlogged on ransoming their victims. So that's just another thing to think about with the frequency. Is it's scary.
Oh yeah, it's kind of like if you think about how exterminators work in reverse. Exterminators will throw traps out in several different locations. I had some problems up in my attic a couple of years back. So they throw out half a dozen traps and they come back in like 3 or 4 weeks and say, hey, which ones actually caught something? Right. It's the same kind of idea, only they're the ones with the varmints instead of the traps. And unfortunately, you don't get to lay the traps in advance.
All you can do traps get so full they can't stop the number. Your traps get so full they can't stop the number of rodents or pests or whatever. So
I may actually use that in a future blog if you don't blog it first. All right, so that's the frequency of the attack. Let's go one more slide forward because here's the problem: attack actually happens. That's an ugly version. So after the attack happens, what percentage of the data is recoverable? Right. And I won't try to break down because all the percentages are gone. It's 0% on all of them, Kelly. But the average percentage of data that is retrievable is 64%. right? So every time that you have a massive attack at scale, you should just kind of plan for a third of your data being encumbered along that way, which I just think is amazing.
Yeah. So
Now,
Brian's got
yeah,
a
yeah.
comp here. So with so many organizations having been attacked, according to the slide, what enhancements does GDV provide if a customer gets attacked and the data is compromised? So going along here with your slide, if 64% of that data is recoverable, how do we kind of help with that? In a lot of our experiences, customers are completely unable to recover their data. We have seen, and this is in the nature of the ransomware attacks, the virus, whatever it is, goes and it tries to encrypt the data. If it can't encrypt it, it deletes it. And if it has the permissions and the appropriate access, it will delete local backups, cloud backups, anything that it can get to. So we've seen customers get hit and lose 100% of their data. Poof, gone. And so Global Data Vault has methods in place. We call it enhanced data protection to protect against that. So we do have some additional protection capabilities that we bring to the table to give customers peace of mind, knowing the damage that ransomware can do. And out of everyone that's been hit, and I can only remember maybe let's say the past five. Out of the past five, 100% of them we've recovered from enhanced data protection, and we've been able to come back from this special area.
So, and I know I mean, it's, I won't say fun to talk about ransomware, but certainly that is what's top of mind for a lot of organizations. I do want to go back to that's not the only thing that causes outages, though.
Yeah.
Right. So if we go back and take a look at outage causality, again, what you're looking at is on the right hand side are the most frequent, so choose all that apply. And then the short line. So the question actually was over the past 2 years, what have been the causes of outages? And we're gonna, and you'll notice that cyber is on the top of the list. In fact, I'm going to tell you that it's sorted by most impactful outage. Most impactful 2021 for the 12-month running, and then also the other short line is the most impactful from 2020. For 2 years in a row, the most impactful outage has been a cyber event. And for all the reasons we talked about, it's a when, not an if. It's massive data destruction, it's massive sprawl. Oh, by the way, it's becoming more and more commonplace. The first thing that the ransomware attacker wants to go do is see if they can infect the backup repositories themselves, which is where your enhanced data protection starts to become really, really interesting and arguably a strong differentiator for GDV within your space. But it's not the only reason that folks need to be thinking about. If the only thing we were solving for is ransomware, BCDR would not be the business that it is today. And so it's worth noting that the top two most impactful sources of outages are both human, right? We got bad humans in the number one slot, and then not that far behind them are silly humans, right? The user that took last month's spreadsheet and then overwrote it with this one, the user that took a really gorgeous Windows-based PowerPoint file and boogered it up because they used a Mac. I mean, whatever the case is, I'm poking fun. But there's bad users and then there's silly users are the top two causes. But that said, take a look on the right edge of that chart, right? Even in 2022, the most common causes of outages is stuff breaks, right? Infrastructure breaks, hard drives die, applications crater, OSs patch badly. Stuff still breaks. And all those reasons why we've been doing business backups for the last 30 years still applies even in 2022.
Yeah, and one of my favorite things about Veeam, and again, it just goes back to the point of you didn't really realize the ease of recovery and disaster recovery until we got into virtualization. Was Veeam's instant Veeam recovery? The whole premise of your primary storage array goes down, or you lose a host, or something happens, and being immediately able to power on virtual machines directly out of the backup file was huge. So you take out probably 2/3 of this list, you can solve it with one feature of backup and replication. And then comes some of the added features. We didn't have cloud options back in the day. We had here's my computers and here's what I had to deal with and here's my backup.
Right.
So we had to come up with ways to get around it. And it isn't until technology advanced more that we see the cybersecurity events, that we have people doing more things and able to click on the wrong buttons themselves. And, hopefully you're looking at least access and zero trust methodology and things like that to negate some of that. But it's a really compelling story. And it's just interesting that so much, even today, still depends on physical things that clank and break.
So one other problem though is that if you think about it, okay, so if we're still assuming that stuff breaks, then surely the cloud, and I'm putting that in quotes and italics with an asterisk on it, surely the cloud becomes a silver bullet that makes all of this go away. And that's just not true.
Nope.
Right. So, we looking at that very first slide, looking at that context that we set up, we've got physical and virtual and multi and hybrid cloud architectures along the way. And I'm going to tell you, cyber doesn't care, right? Accidental deletion, you can delete a file on a cloud storage just as easily as you can delete it on-prem, right? Amazon's hard drives still break. Your instances of Windows, even when they're cloud hosted, still can patch badly, right? So on none of these is the cloud a silver bullet that absolves of this, which is why, and oh, by the way, the other thing to think about, which we didn't really cover on here, this is just about outages, right? And so while you're probably not going to fail over Office 365 or Salesforce or something like that, just because you decided to run part of your business on a service instead of a server does not absolve you of 5-year retention mandates, data destruction mandates. All of those regulatory mandates around data protection still apply, even if you don't own the metal. Yeah. So a lot of that, and Will brought up a comment here. So, not all, seems the vast majority, if not all, are not acts of God. Yeah, no. We don't even actually, hurricane and fire and that didn't even score even 1%, which is why I didn't make the charts. This is not where your outages really come from at scale compared to any others. That's a fair point. Thank you, Will. So anyway, so that's the data. That's the circumstance that we're trying to solve for from this. And it's actually the end of the Veeam slide. So Kelly, I'm interested in hearing what the GDV answer is for a couple of the problems that we talked about.
Yeah, and that's, that information is really helpful, and I'm really glad that we can see it. Having that breadth of knowledge, I can tell you all day, every week I come in here and do the webinars and say, here's what you should be doing. You're only hearing it from me, right? So it's really great that we have a source like this report. So again, I want to encourage people to download it from the URL. But Jason mentioned a silver bullet. We've talked about the ease of DR as a service. It's not all Hollywood makes it out to be, right? It isn't magic. We see people typing away furiously on keyboards, and suddenly they're hacked into the infrastructure. And we see people typing on their phone, and suddenly the world's movie content is right here, and they can do whatever. And it's not magic. It's still technology. We still have hard drive speeds and internet speeds and copper and fiber and all of these limitations to the capability of what we can do. So the truth about DRaaS is it's not going to happen overnight. Now, the failing too, like the turning on, the bringing up the systems, the applications, and the workloads is almost magical. Okay, let's not go wrong there, because that's some pretty cool, stuff that happens to enable that. That happens very quickly. It's the getting the data back. It's the putting things back to as close to the way they were, or returning to operations as closely as you can. That takes a while. We have to somehow get data from our cloud or from any cloud back to where it's supposed to be. That isn't necessarily a quick process, and it takes time. And unfortunately, Hollywood has a big part in this, and marketing. No offense to all the marketing people, but they tend to just play on the best of things, the brightest points, and the truth of the facts sort of get left behind to experience later. But when we look to recover, we're always going to look to do the critical components first. Not always, but sometimes we do hear people complain about their print server that they can't get to, or some lower hanging fruit that isn't necessarily critical to running your business comes into play. But traditionally, we see the critical components are going to come first. And Trista posted a link to how to create a disaster recovery plan. Part of that is identifying what those systems are, in what order they should come up, how you should recover them, et cetera. I suggest and propose that you also have some kind of a plan and in place to get all of that back. How's it going to happen? Who's going to be in charge of what? Who's going to manage what processes of it? And sometimes when these outages are going on and tensions are high, things are happening, we have to set expectations that we as a cloud provider and a DRaaS provider have to protect ourselves too. We store petabytes of data, and we are under the assumption that all of it is infected with malware. It's not. Don't worry, right? But we have to think of ourselves, because we protect petabytes of data. And if we have one instance where we let something into our environment that shouldn't be there, we put at risk petabytes of data. So sometimes a DRaaS provider will tell you no. They may say, no, we're not able to do that for you, even though it seems so easy. We also have to take a step back and protect the rest of the data that we have. Make sure that we're not mitigating propagating that to anybody else, right? So I just want to be a little bit transparent there and just be like, things aren't magic. We're doing everything logistically and accurately and in a safe manner that we can to bring business back up and running, or get your business back up and running. We do it really well with Veeam. So yeah. And I think there was another question about the 3-2-1 rule up there. That is
there was
something
also something that I hope you get to cover. There was a question earlier around ransomware and data protection. You touched on enhanced data protection. But that to me is actually one of the most interesting and differentiable features in the GDV portfolio.
Yeah, so the 3-2-1 rule, we extend it, and we extend it with enhanced data protection. So basically the 3 copies of data to 2 different media, 1 offsite, we add additional copy offsite. And what that looks like to what we call a tenant, a customer, a client, right, is a copy of their data disappears. So we take it, we gap it, we take a copy of it, keep it somewhere else that is inaccessible from the customer's network. And therefore it is inaccessible to any ransomware, viruses, accidental deletions, insider threats, you name it. Anything that originates from the customer's network cannot touch this data. And we kind of do some cool things with it by keeping an entire copy of the backup chain in that repository. So, sometimes if your incrementals, something happens to them, you can't recover. If something in your repository gets kind of mucked up, you can't recover. Well, we keep an entire copy of that backup chain in the repository at all times. So we can recover different restore points, different times. We can go back in time, not necessarily just the most recent backup, to make sure that we can get what you need from maybe before it was corrupted or before it was infected, something like that. The other cool thing that it does is, we do disaster recovery testing. Everybody should do it. If you're not, stop, drop, and test, right? We have it so that, and you can use that one too. I'll give you my address for the check.
Yeah.
When you think about disaster recovery tests, we build disaster recovery as a service into what we do. We base a lot of things off of backup files. So when you send a backup to our repository, we use that data to do a disaster recovery test, to test your backups, make sure everything comes up, et cetera. If you have enhanced data protection, we can actually do the disaster recovery test from that data. So we are testing it as well, and we are then not interfering with your primary backup files. So your cloud files are able to do the backup merges, are able to continue as usual, and we're actually testing your data from a different source, which is just yet another value add that EDP brings.
I will never forget the first time that I was talking with some of the GDV staff around ransomware preparedness, and GDV's actually produced 2 what we call Vanguards, which are our best, our brightest, our most influential awarded outside influencers along the way. And one of your engineering leaders, Stephen New, was talking about the enhanced data protection, and there was just like, the folks on our side of the call were just super impressed by, oh, wow, that's pretty amazing as far as what you do there. So certainly in the context of a ransomware conversation. That should be something that everybody really understands the power that can provide from a cyber preparedness perspective.
Yeah, and we offer it so we offer BAS and DRAS. You know, we don't feel that BAS is a complete solution, but if it's something somebody wants, we do offer it, and we do offer enhanced data protection with that. So from basic to full, we're going to offer that solution for you. Obviously, it doesn't work with something like backup from Microsoft 365. That's a little bit different data source and solutioning there. But yeah, we can make it work with BAS and DRAS from clouds, on premises, hybrid, anything like that. Offer that solution, which isn't something that I don't think anybody else can do, personally.
I think you're right. All right, we've covered most of the questions along the way, and the big hands on the 12. So, Stephen, Kelly, Trista, anyone want to finish this out?
I think that we are a wrap. So I can't thank you enough for joining us today, Jason. That was really insightful, and apologies for the technical surprises that we have had. It seems like they all decided to happen today. So
Business
No
apologies
worries.
for
continuity
that. But
for
we'll,
life. Yep.
yeah. All right. So thanks everyone for joining us today. We will put a cleaned up recap of this on our website here in a few days. And if you'd like to be notified of any of our future webinars, you can join that email notification list at globaldatavault.com/webinars. And I appreciate everybody for joining. Be sure and follow our social channels for any of our updates. So appreciate it. Thanks again. See you next month.
Bye-bye.